Professor Tsoukalis.
Thank you very much. Let me start with a brief historical background. Let me just remind ourselves that European integration has been characterized by a continuous expansion in terms of both membership and functions over the years. This continuous expansion, pretty remarkable, is also the surest sign of success. But success, like many other things in life, has come at a price. And the price has been mainly in the form of increased diversity within this union and reduced capacity of European institutions to deliver the goods. To put it differently, over the years, we've been witnessing in Europe a growing mismatch between ambitions and the means to fulfill those ambitions. The most extreme example of this mismatch was the creation of the euro. When the Europeans decided back in the early 1990s, essentially for high political reasons, which had to do more with the Berlin Wall and less with exchange rates, to create a monetary union without being willing to endow it with the necessary institutions and policy instruments to make it sustainable in the long term. So when the crisis hit, and of course it was bad luck that the first big test for Europe's young currency coincided with the biggest international financial crisis since 1929. But then we turned bad luck into a disaster because the international financial crisis hit a Eurozone that was not prepared for such a thing. It did not have the institutions. It did not have the policy instruments. And the result of that crisis, if I may again summarize very briefly, is there's good news and there is bad news. The good news is that we have survived against the odds and against predictions of all kinds of doomsayers, more, to be fair, on the other side of the Channel and the United States than on continental Europe. But many people remember in the early years of the crisis were predicting disaster, were predicting disintegration. That was the end of the process. It didn't happen. So this is the good news. The bad news is that we have paid a very big price to keep together. We have paid a big price in terms of loss of output, loss of jobs, and we've paid a very big price in terms of toxic politics and fragmentation, both between our countries and within our countries. So that's one side of the story. There's also something else, and this is another important long-term trend. And this is that European integration has been taking place in the last, I would say, 2 to 3 decades in the context of a steadily deteriorating economic environment. What is the characteristic of that period? It is slow growth and increased economic divergence between countries, but even more so within countries. So these are the characteristics of the last 25 to 30 years. Slow growth, increased divergence between countries, between, if you want to simplify too much, between North and South, between the North and the Southern periphery, and also increased divergence within countries because of growing income inequalities within our countries. These things are not, of course, directly or mostly the result of European integration or monetary integration. They also have to do with wider long-term global trends. But it is extremely difficult to separate the effect of being a member of the euro currency and being a member of an increasingly global economic environment. To give you an example, and Martin already mentioned Italy, to what extent is Italy's economic stagnation of the last 20 years the result of its inability to manage globalization? And to what extent is it the result of membership of the Eurozone and the inability to have recourse to devaluations, which was the way for Italy to restore competitiveness in the previous world? So this is, let's say, where we come from. Now, where do we stand? And if I may add, if I were to summarize European integration over the long period in one phrase, which of course is an extremely daring act, but I will try it. This is the phrase I would use: ever bigger, more intrusive, and less inclusive in a deteriorating economic environment. And that's difficult. Now, what are the challenges facing us today? Don't have much time, so therefore I shall be very brief. And there will be an overlap with what Martin has already said. I believe in economic terms, there are three fundamental challenges facing Europe today. One has to do with restoring conditions for inclusive growth. So not only growth, but inclusive growth that deals with divergence between countries and even more so within countries. Unless we manage to deal with the problem of social inclusion, we have a ticking bomb in our democratic systems throughout Europe, not to mention the United States. The second big challenge is to create a sustainable Eurozone in the long term. And the third big challenge is to prepare for the next financial crisis. And the question is not whether the crisis comes, but the question is only when. Okay, so let me go through those three main challenges for Europe. And of course, I cannot provide you with a long, comprehensive list of what is to be done, but let me raise just a few questions and point to policy choices, because all those challenges involve extremely difficult and painful policy choices. Talking about inclusive growth, I mean, all predictions of international organizations point to relatively modest growth in the Western world, and Europe in particular, in the next 10 to 15 years. And they also point to widening inequalities within our countries. If both of those things happen, we are in deep trouble, politically and economically. Now, how do you restore conditions of inclusive growth? Easier said than done. But let me point to possible difficult trade-offs. Is there, for example, a trade-off between competitiveness and social justice and equality? If there is such a thing, especially as regards the liberalization of labor markets, we have an extremely difficult political decision to make, especially for countries that do not have strong and effective welfare states to deal with the unequal consequences of the market, and especially of a much more liberalized labor market. How do you deal with that? And this problem is going to be much more acute, and has been much more acute, for social democrats who have experienced in the last few decades the loss of a large part of their voters, because simply those voters are the people who have been left behind in the process of globalization and economic change. Number two, creating a sustainable Eurozone. Again, you need to reconcile two very different, and I will simplify again, approaches to the problem in the Eurozone. There is, on the one hand, the approach which is mostly German and which can be summarized in the famous Ohio principle. Ohio stands for own house in order, which means put your house in order, preferably do it like us, Germans, follow our example, and the rest will follow. No need for anything else. So individual country reform. And there is the other, the opposite side, that is put forward by Italians, Southerners, also to a large extent the French, who say that the problem of the Eurozone is essentially systemic. You need more risk sharing, you need more solidarity, you need stronger institutions, you need a banking union and all the rest. Of course, you need to reconcile the two. Neither side has the absolute monopoly of truth. But how do you reconcile individual country reforms with systemic changes at the level of the Eurozone? And third, again, possible trade-off, preparing for the next financial crisis to come. Of course, we need to complete banking union. But in order to complete banking union, you have to reconcile, again, risk sharing with risk reduction. The Germans insist on risk sharing, and the Italians want risk reduction. Now, you have to find... sorry, I forgot. I'm sorry. Yes, the Germans want risk reduction, and the Italians want risk sharing. I'm sorry. Thank you. Again, easy said than done, but there are interesting, intelligent ways of trying to reconcile the two. But it's not going to be easy. So these are the policy challenges. These are some of the trade-offs, and I will shut up. Thank you.